So what happens to get inflation between 8 and 12% by the end of this year? Break that down for us.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'll say that I know that I'm the minority report on this. I'm getting used to it. I started to talk about the risk of looming inflation in 2020 when it was definitely fringe. At least now it's in the mainstream because Americans and people around the world are living it. What I have said is that I don't believe that we've seen the end of inflation, that I do think that we're going to see another spike up, turn up. And whether it's 8, 10, 12, of course, I have no idea, nor can I say precisely by the end of 2023. But I do believe that it is possible that we find ourselves back in that range this year in 2023. Why do I say that? Well, first, a little history. When you look at the history of, at least in the 20th century, of inflations, the big ones in Europe and in the US, what you see is that inflation doesn't move in a linear path. You do see this cycling up, down, up, down. That's the first point. And I think we've seen some relief for some specific reasons. You mentioned that inflation in January was 6.4, down from 9.1 in June. Step in the right direction, still too high. If you look at it on a compound basis over the last 2 years, Americans have lost around 14, 15% of their purchasing power. And by the way, that's, of course, if you believe CPI is an accurate reflection of what people are experiencing, which we don't.
That's a whole other conversation, but let's assume that it is, because that's the data that you're citing will hit 8 to 12%. So let's work off that premise.
So if you move beyond that to what is really driving inflation, it, of course, has been energy. It's true in Europe. It's true here. We've seen double-digit rises in energy prices across the board, overall energy. Now it's starting to come down again, where you saw energy in January, 8.7%, et cetera. But other factors, and even food coming down as a result. Other factors, I just wrote a big piece on electricity, that we've had double-digit 16% electricity in the past year, and that's going to get worse. So why do I think it's going to persist? Well, there's some specific factors, or things like electricity, that we know that many of the regional power companies have put in applications through the regulator to increase prices this coming year by anywhere between 15 and 20%, depending on the region. PG&E, Florida Power and Light, Georgia Power, all across the nation. Why? In order to recoup some of the fuel costs that we saw spike last year. Natural gas went up and came back down. Coal prices tripled during 2022. So there is a specific reason, but that's actually not the argument I'm making. The argument I'm making is, if you think about all of the reasons we were given, whether by government officially or in the media, about what caused inflation, it was everything from Putin's price hike to COVID, unlocking of the economy. There's some truth to that, to be sure. Greedy farmers, greedy truckers, greedy oil companies. When you cut through all of that, you hear everything except the actual reason. What is the actual cause of inflation? It's always government. It's always government printing money. So my argument is as follows. If you look at what's happened since the global financial crisis, we have had a tripling of the US dollar money supply, M2 basis, from just over 7 trillion to 22 trillion at the end of 21 trillion at the end of 2022. Now, by the way, that money supply increased by 40% just from the year 2000. You cannot, and you've never had a time in history where the money supply increases by that much without it resulting in inflation. And again, if you look at that same history, at least of the data we have from the 20th century, inflation, price inflation always catches up with money supply inflation. It may not be 100%, could be 60%, it could be 80%, but it always gets there. Now, part of this, of course, these are facts that are known to everyone. We've increased the national debt to 31 trillion. We've got 19 trillion of cumulative deficits since 2001. By themselves, debt doesn't cause inflation. Deficits don't cause inflation. But when you increase the money supply beyond demand, beyond aggregate demand, in order to supply that debt to fuel those deficits, that's where you run into problems. The big takeaway here is that price inflations lag the money supply inflation, and oftentimes by several years. So part of the argument I'm making here is we've got a great big catch up to do on money supply inflation, and sooner or later it will be reflected in prices.